And so we would start with the fifth panel that we have entitled The Future of Financial Regulation, after a very long journey debating several issues in terms of financial regulation and supervision. With the permission of Christos and Michael, and just to, since we have discussed so much Europe, I would perhaps start with Asia, if it is okay with Christos, and then moving back to Europe with Christos' presentation. I would merely start the ball rolling. I would leave then the conclusion basically to Martin and Josina for final questions and debate and concluding remarks. So without further ads, I would give the floor to Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Luis. It's a pleasure to be back at this conference. Until 2 years ago, I think I attended every one of these conferences. And then in 2016, Luis mentioned we were here at the time of the Brexit vote. And unfortunately, for the last 2 years, I've suffered my own Brexit. I haven't been able to participate, and it's a great pleasure to be back again. On the program, you'll see that I'm down to talk about is Asia at risk of a financial crisis. Rather than answer that question, I've had media training, and in media training they always teach you to answer the question you want to answer rather than the question you've been asked. So I'm going to narrow down the question a little bit, and is China at risk of a financial crisis? And I think there are a number of reasons why Asia avoided a financial crisis 10 years ago. And the most important are that Asia's banking systems were deposit funded, that Asia was relatively insulated from the global financial system, that Asian banks had not acquired some of the structured products which were at the root of the crisis, and Asia's trade-dependent economies benefited greatly from the huge stimulus that China adopted in 2009, which led China's economy to grow very rapidly over the last 10 years. And actually, China has contributed about 1/3 of global growth over the last 10 years. Now, one of the consequences of that is that debt levels in China have risen quite dramatically, and that's often seen as a leading indicator of a financial crisis. In fact, at this conference a few years ago, I remember a presentation given by Viral Acharya before he became a deputy governor of the Reserve Bank of India, a position from which he recently resigned. He gave a presentation where he talked about some research that he and his team had been doing at New York University, and they were predicting a financial crisis in China. And it's not hard to understand why, because debt buildups on the scale that China has experienced often has led to a financial crisis. And as you can see in this slide, for countries that have experienced debt accumulation at the pace and extent to which it's happened in China, they have gone, in the great majority of cases, they've gone on to experience a financial crisis. So there is certainly some prima facie evidence to suggest that China, in engaging this very rapid buildup of debt, is at risk of a financial crisis. And as you can see, that debt continues to accumulate, and our forecasts over the next couple of years is that China's debt load will continue to rise even as economic growth slows down. But, and this is very important, there are some major differences in China's financial system compared to a Western one, which means that the risk of a debt crisis occurring in China is actually relatively low. The large banks in China are state-owned. Most of the lending that they do goes to state-owned enterprises. So essentially, it's state-owned banks funding state-owned enterprises. The government effectively controls the balance sheets of a number of major entities in the country, not just the banks, but also the state-owned enterprises, and as I'll talk about a bit later, the balance sheets of the regional and local governments, and has the capacity to mobilize those balance sheets and to allocate losses across those balance sheets, all of which limit the extent to which a debt crisis could emerge. The capital and liquidity buffers of the big state-owned banks, so the big four state-owned banks, China Construction Bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, ICBC, Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China, those big four banks do have fairly substantial capital and liquidity buffers. They are predominantly still deposit funded. The savings rate in China is extremely high. The capital account remains relatively closed. All of that acts as a powerful mitigant against the risk of the rapid levels of debt accumulation that we've seen over the last 10 years being transformed into a debt crisis. So I think the first conclusion to reach is that despite that rapid run-up of debt, it is actually quite unlikely that China is going to suffer a system-wide financial crisis, that there are some powerful mitigants there. But that's not to say that there aren't some major risks that we need to focus on as far as China's financial system is concerned. The first one is that the financial system structure is rapidly evolving. And one of the things that you have to remember about China is how rapidly things change. And one of the things that I constantly remind my team in Asia is things might have looked okay 2 years ago, but look again. See how far things have changed, how fast things have changed. And in China, things do change very, very rapidly. And one of the things that you can see from this chart, over a relatively short period of time, we've got the data to 2017 here, but from 2010 to 2017, look at what happens to the share of financial assets of the 5 biggest banks. They go down from 42% in 2010 to 28% 7 years later. That's a massive shift in the structure of the financial system. And what takes up the difference, what makes up the difference, is the assets managed by non-bank financial intermediaries, that light green bar. And also, there's an increase, a bit of an increase in this light blue section, which is the assets of the small and mid-sized banks. So this is quite an interesting development, both in terms of the very rapid evolution of China's financial system structure, but also in the relation to some of the topics that we've been discussing today, non-bank financial institutions and their importance from the point of view of systemic risk, and also these small and medium-sized banks. Now, everything is relative. And in China's case, when you talk about small and medium-sized banks, you're talking about banks which in balance sheet terms, on a global basis, are actually pretty large. I mean, they're in, or some of them at least, are in the top 100 of banks by asset size in the Bankers Magazine's annual survey. So some bank in a Chinese province that you may never have heard of is in the top 100 banks in the world. So these are actually pretty substantial institutions. So the Chinese authorities have focused on the risks that are related to this evolving financial system structure. And about 2 years ago, they started what they called a regulatory windstorm, which aimed to reduce risks in the shadow banking sector, in the non-bank financial institutions. Because what we were seeing increasingly was that these small and medium-sized banks were increasingly integrated with the shadow banking system. They were buying assets from the shadow banks and often selling assets to the shadow banks. So the small and medium-sized banks were becoming increasingly integrated with the shadow banking system. The authorities became concerned about that. They began a regulatory crackdown, which was very successful and has been very successful in terms of reducing the size of the shadow banking system, which has gone down from over 80%, about 84% of GDP 2 years ago, to now round about 64%. So there's been quite a substantial shrinkage in the scale of the shadow banking system. Now, some of that has been because the shadow banks were effectively trading financial assets with each other or with these small and medium-sized banks, and the regulatory crackdown has impacted that. Now, that was basically intra-financial system transactions, which had very little effect on the supply of credit to the real economy, but increasingly in the last year, we've seen the impact in terms of credit supply to the real economy, particularly for privately owned enterprises, which find it difficult to get funding from the big state-owned banks, and in the past have been reliant on shadow credit for funding. And they have now experienced quite a substantial contraction in the supply of credit to that sector, which the authorities, again, are now quite concerned about. But so far, at least, they haven't managed to solve the problem of how you crack down on shadow banks while maintaining credit supply to some of the main customers. Where I think the story about risks of a financial crisis in China gets really interesting, and I think there are some parallels here with what we've been talking about during the rest of the day in terms of the European Union. Now, one way of thinking about the risks in China is that China is a country which has a completed banking union. We have 4 big state-owned banks which operate on a national basis. The costs of any financial crisis are going to be fiscalized at the central government level. So you could say, well, this is a completed banking union, so where are the parallels? The parallels are that the provinces in China actually are much more independent than I think many outside observers really understand. There is a very old Chinese proverb which goes back well into the imperial era about that heaven is high above and the emperor is far away. And in China, the provincial level leadership have great power. They have great authority. And again, one of the things which is not really understood is that the central government in China is actually quite small. Now, how large the central government bureaucracy in Beijing really is, it's very difficult to find out because that's a state secret. They don't publish these kinds of data. So you don't know how many people are employed in that central government bureaucracy. Some people I talk to say the number of people employed in the central government bureaucracy in Beijing is smaller than the European Commission. So if you think in terms of a country of the size of China with 1.4 billion people, where is the government administration? It's not in Beijing. It's not in the center. It's down at the provincial and lower levels. So what that means is that you have certain provinces in China. There are 31 provinces. And again, to put all this into context, a few years ago, I was at a conference in Hangzhou, which is in Zhejiang province, about an hour's train ride from Shanghai. And Zhejiang is one of the centers of China's high-tech industry. It's where Alibaba has its headquarters. And the conference was opened by one of the vice governors of Zhejiang. And he said, well, we're not such a big province. We only have 55 million people. So you put it into context. Again, of course, in terms of per capita GDP, there's no real comparison. But if you put this into context, these provinces have populations which are larger than most European countries. And in some cases, their economies now are larger than most European countries. So what we did here was we did a risk ranking of the provinces. If you think about the provinces as having risk independently of the central government, then what we did was we looked at the debt service ratios of locally owned state-owned enterprises, local government-owned state-owned enterprises. We looked at the contingent liabilities of the regional and local governments. We looked at NPL levels as reported across the different provinces, and we applied a number of filters. And what this map shows you is that there are certain provinces which are at much higher risk than others, and the darker the red the province, the more risk that province presents. Now, not surprisingly, some of the higher risk provinces are, as you can see, towards the northeast, which is essentially China's Rust Belt. These are the provinces that were at the center of the old industrial structure of China, the old heavy industries, the coal mining, the steel. And as China's industrial structure has changed, those provinces have become ones in which the old industrial structure has been involved overcapacity industries, and the authorities, the Chinese government, have been trying to reduce capacity in some of these industries. However, I think the basic story is, out of these 31 provinces, not all of the provinces are equal. Some of them are much more exposed than others. And this is one way in which we've tried to explain the complex interrelationships at provincial level between the regional and local governments, RLGs, local government-owned, state-owned enterprises, or local government financing vehicles, which are the mechanism through which many regional and local governments have financed this massive infrastructure investment that we've seen over the last 10 years. We've got the local banks, and remember, these might appear to be small, but in balance sheet terms, they're actually pretty significant institutions. We've got shadow banks. So there's down at the provincial level, there's a complex financial system of interlinkages, so that if you started to see pressures building at the provincial level, and those provinces where the industrial structure is most out of date and is most outmoded are the ones where you might see or might expect to see those pressures starting to emerge, then this is where these complex interrelationships would come into play. So you have various mechanisms through which financial shocks could be transmitted. One last point is just in terms of capital flows. One of the key factors which mitigates against a debt crisis emerging in China is that the capital account still remains relatively closed. And actually, in the last 5 years, it has become more closed. The Chinese authorities have clamped down on capital outflows very successfully. So we look at the renminbi depreciation. We don't think that that has any kind of immediate credit impact. The authorities are still committed to maintaining a reasonably stable rate of the renminbi against other currencies. Capital flows have been reasonably resilient. But where things may start to get interesting in future years is on the current account. Because effectively what China's been doing over the years is been running large current account deficits, current account surpluses, which has been the opposite result of the large export surpluses that it's been running. So that's shown up in terms of large current account surpluses. That's fed capital inflows into the country. Now, in recent years, we've started to see the current account move from surplus to near balance, and in fact, there have been a couple of months when it's run into deficit. Now, that is nothing to do with the current trade tensions with the US. This is a long-term structural change. This is as a result of the way that the Chinese government has been trying to restructure its industrial structure. It's been trying to move towards a more domestic-based economy, one which is less reliant on exports, long before these trade tensions with the US began. That obviously increases the move towards a more domestically focused industrial structure. But it does mean that the capital inflows that we've seen as a result of these large current account surpluses in the past are now more or less a thing of the past. And so the question is, what does that mean for financial stability going forward? I think that's something worth looking at. Because if China is unable to attract either foreign direct investment flows or portfolio inflows, then we would expect to see some pressure starting to emerge as a result of the evaporation of those current account surpluses. So just by way of conclusion, a financial crisis in China at the national systemic level remains very unlikely. There could be pressures at provincial level, and certain provinces could be exposed to the risk of not necessarily a financial crisis, but certainly serious financial pressures, in which case the central government would have to intervene and to provide the fiscal transfers necessary for a bailout. And we expect that they would, and they have the capacity to do that. And it's, in a sense, it becomes very similar to the situation that's existed in the US. If you think back to the 1980s and the Texas banking crisis, effectively that was resolved through fiscal transfers from the federal government. And so a similar kind of story would operate in terms of China as well. As long as China keeps a relatively closed capital account, we don't expect that those problems to manifest themselves. So where China may face an issue in future is either at the provincial level, or it could be that as growth continues to slow down and debt levels continue to rise, we end up with what we've in our research publications called a slow burn scenario, where effectively the rising debt levels leads to a further growth slowdown, to further inefficiencies, and that's a story of long-term growth declines and stagnation. So no immediate financial crisis. You can sleep easy about that, but there are certain issues in terms of China's financial system that bear looking at in future. Thank you very much.